Today, we tell the story of a China-born American and the dynamic changes he has witnessed over the decades. We also tell the story of more than 91 million CPC members battling COVID-19, determined to make the party's first centenary goals happen, with China's ruling party, the CPC, celebrating its 99th anniversary this week. The world seeks to get a glimpse of the country's future course. What is China's direction? How should the political system be understood outside? And what can be learned about the country's future and experience of a Westerner who has watched it for decades? To find out more, I'm joined today by Professor Fred Ernst of the University of International Business and Economics, Professor Zhang Weiwei, Director of the China Institute of Fudan University, and Dr. Robert Lawrence Kuhn, Chairman of the Kuhn Foundation. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Zhou Yue. Dr. Ernst, first of all, welcome to our program.
Thank you for inviting me.
I know that you liken yourself to an egg that is white on the outside, yellow on the inside. Why do you make such a metaphor?
Well, actually, it's my mother who invented that term.
Your mother?
Yeah, because in the West, in the U.S. in particular, there are many Chinese Americans that look like Chinese, but actually more like a Westerner in their heart. Yeah, so they're like bananas, and yellow outside, white inside. And so my mother says, well, actually, all of us grew up in China. We are more like an egg, white outside, but tempered, or grew up in China, so have a lot of Chinese culture that. So that's how she invented that.
Probably there are many bananas in the world, but not a lot of eggs.
That's true.
What is it like to be an egg?
Well, it's a mixed experience and has a lot of sort of we classify ourselves as the fourth world, neither Chinese nor American. And so growing up in China, the people always saying, you're American, you're American. And then I went to the U.S. and they said, you're Chinaman, Chinaman. So we don't belong to anywhere.
And where is the line of being a Chinese and being an American in you? Or is it just melted together?
There's no line. Because, see, compared to a Chinese, we are not raised with the Chinese culture in the family setting. For example, when you go to Chinese New Year's and all the relatives get together, you got to know who to call the proper name, all right? So there's a different name for father's older brother, father's younger brother, mother's older brother, younger brother. I mean, just all very hierarchical. But in the Western, just uncle.
So that's a totally different cultural background.
Right. So I did not raise in that kind of a conscious hierarchy type of thing. And so as a consequence, when I brought my daughters to China in the 80s and 90s, when I visit to my classmates' family, they always call me this name, that name, but I never trained my kids to use anything. So I realized there's a big difference in the culture. Even though I'm raised in China, it's not that deep-rooted in Chinese culture.
And do your children, your daughters, also identify themselves as eggs?
No.
But they understand they have some parts of Chinese tradition.
Yeah, well, of course, in a very young age, and they came to China to visit my parents, their grandparents, and so they have exposure to a very different world than their neighbors and then their classmates.
And are they serving them well, those different?
Oh, yeah.
Talking about their grandparents, your parents, your father, Irvin, came to China to join the communist revolutions after reading Edgar Snow's book.
Yeah, that's part of it, yeah.
And well, he married your mother here in China.
Yeah. But actually, see, he happened to be a roommate with my uncle, Bill Hinton, and for 1 year in Cornell.
Your mother's brother.
Right. So that's how the two families got to know each other. And also through that, my aunt, my mother's older sister, and she was a Communist Party member, and she always persuading my father, my uncle, to fight fascists and to bring all kinds of progressive literature.
Your aunt was an American Communist Party member?
Yes, okay. Yes. And so that influenced my dad. Yeah. So he decided to come to China, take a look. So he's not like he was really a staunch communist or anything. He was just a dairyman. Dairyman with the...
But why China out of all places?
Well, it's because he read Richard Snow, and also his buddy, my uncle, was in China. And then so with Edgar Snow's book, and he was really curious about what's like under the communist left area. So he came to China under the United Nations Relief Program, UNRWA program. And then after less than a few months, and he decided to leave that, and he just went to Yan'an. And so he went to Yan'an before the Civil War broke out. So I have the dates in this book. I can't remember, but there's a date that he went to Yan'an, and then...
before the communists evacuated.
Right. It's that evacuation experience that really transformed him.
Okay. Why so?
Because, you know, he experienced in 1 year time the nationalists invading Yan'an, and the Yan'an, the Communist Army has only like 40,000. So 400,000 versus 40,000 something, and so the my number could be wrong, but it's almost 10 to 1.
Okay.
And then they actually were able to, before they leave, they were able to take what they need and bury everything, hide everything. And my father was with the, he being a dairyman, went to Yan'an, and he was on a dairy farm.
Oh.
A dairy farm has about 30-some cows, and their task is trying to take care of this herd of cows, and without being captured by the nationalists. And so what he experienced in that 1 year, well, very beginning, they were able to break the encirclement of the nationalists. And it's just incredible. Like my father wrote to my grandmother in the letter, he describes that how they cleared the Yan'an. And he says, well, with a typical exaggeration, that if a crow flying by has to bring its own lunch.
Everyone has it on their own.
Yeah, it's
that
like,
hard.
They cannot find anything. And then the local people are the eyes and the ears of the communists. And the nationalist troop going there, they cannot find anything. And
so the connect between the communists with the
people
is obvious.
Oh, it's tremendous. It's tremendous.
And also, you chose to come back to Beijing to teach in 2007, after 3 decades living and working in the United States.
Right.
Why did you yourself make such a choice?
Well, I mean, I always interested in that part
That's
of
almost
history.
50 years after your parents came to China.
Right. Well, I left China in '74 when I was 21, and spent 30 years trying to assimilate into the U.S. and failed to do so.
you did?
Yeah. I try to be Americans, but I find out just really hard, because what they are interested, what grabbed their interest, I mean, just so different. And there are some superficial differences, but there are also very deep-rooted differences.
What is it?
Well, I mean, for one thing, I just find the racism in the U.S. is really hard to deal with. That's one part of it. And also, what really struck me first time was in the first Gulf War. I was working at AT&T those days, and so I was really pissed off about having the war in the Middle East. And so I had a banner in my office that says, "No blood for oil." And my office mates, my manager says, "Well, we are helping the Kuwait. We're liberating the Kuwait."
But you didn't agree.
But obviously, this is just ridiculous. We are liberating the trade. It's all about oil. And so that kind of just, the people in the U.S. don't have a sense what the role of the U.S. is in the world stage. And so that kind of divide is really hard to overcome. And also, I'm just really interested in the 30 years New China, the politics and economics as a Mao's period. And that's my lifelong pursuit of interest. And where is a better place to study that?
It is obviously a different China now in 2020. Are you still happy living, working in China?
Oh, very rewarding, because all the things I'm interested in studying, there's a lot of resources for me to pursue my research interest.
And I'm watching Dialogue. We'll take a short break, and coming back, we'll talk to Dr. Kuhn and Professor Zhang Weiwei. Let me start with you, Dr. Kuhn. There has been a great deal of mostly negative attention and coverage in international media concerning China's leading party, the CPC, and its leader, President Xi, and his consolidation of power, some say. How should we understand these coverages and the narratives?
It's very easy when you're looking at another culture to see it one-dimensionally or homogeneously, and almost always that's not the case. As far as American views of China, China's views of America is very much the same. It's a lot of different strands that one needs to analyze to really understand that issue. Overall, though, it is certainly true that attitudes in the United States towards China are at historic lows as far as polling has been. Something like 2/3 of the American population today have a more negative view of China, which is the lowest it's ever been. So it's worth analyzing why that's the case. But to get a real understanding, one has to stratify Americans into general population, which I've just described, and the elite, and then the subclass of the elite, who are those who have interest in China, who have business interests in China, or intellectual interests, or are so-called China watchers, because they set the tone for everything else. It used to be the case. There's a very interesting political analysis of the U.S. that within each major political party, Democrats and Republicans, there was more difference on China within each party than there were between the two parties. And I would say I can't think of another issue in which that's been the case. If you take anything, immigration, taxes, welfare, the differences within the party are much less than the difference between the parties. That was not the case with China. But we've seen a change, I'd say beginning in 2015, maybe with a little respite, and then more recently it's been accelerated by the pandemic, that the attitudes have become hardened. And this is a deep problem, and it's a problem that is not susceptible to simplistic answers.
And Professor Zhang, I want your take on this. Of course, China, under the leadership of the CPC, has been enjoying probably more economic and even military powers. But in terms of philosophical power, those soft powers to the world, how can the CPC sell the message to the rest of the world in the eyes of many still believe not necessarily a positive image of CPC?
In the first place, I make a small correction. I would not say it's the international media coverage. It's Western media coverage of China. It's more negative than positive. In many ways, it's regrettable. If you want to understand China today, it's the ABC of modern China knowledge. That is, the CPC is an overwhelmingly positive force for China. That's the consensus of most Chinese. If you don't know that, you cannot understand modern China, China today. And I just give you an example. The latest, what's called the Democracy Perception Index. It's based on opinion surveys in 52 or more countries, conducted by a very mainstream Western research institution based in Germany and Denmark. 95% Chinese surveyed think their country has done a great job in fighting the pandemic. And in other words, the country is on the right track. So it's the highest among all the countries surveyed. So I always say, to understand this CPC, you have to understand the nature of China as a civilizational state. It's an amalgamation of hundreds of states into one over its long history. And as a result, if we talk about the one-party system, that's the grudge of the Western media and Western view. In China's long history, over 2,000 years, a unified state since 221 BC. In most cases, China was ruled under a kind of one-party system, what we call one unified ruling entity. The CPC has continued with this tradition and developed this tradition. It's the people, the leaders are selected based on what we call the meritocracy. Yeah, if the Western system is about election, the Chinese system is about selection plus election. We have a leadership is so competent, really. I think the West will regret if they continue to ignore the Chinese model and China's experience. It's doing well, really. Come to China to see the progress China has made.
And Dr. Kuhn, about the competence issue, obviously COVID-19 has been seen as a stress test on different systems. But do Americans share the same views and assessments about how the Chinese responded, how the Americans responded to this?
I think you have to segregate the analysis of response to the epidemic into two, to be simplistic, two time periods. One is the period of time when it first emerged, whenever that is. There's a lot of speculation, and the time when China made its decision around January 22nd, 23rd, to go for full lockdown. Clearly, from that time forward, those who understand and follow China and follow the world, which is not the large majority of the people, but those who understand realize that what China did, the draconian lockdown, was essential and was successful. Now, not perfectly successful, of course, but that model worked, and that model, frankly, can only work as far as large countries are concerned in China because of the nature of the system. So the stress test of the pandemic in terms of once it came about, unquestionably China had the capacity to do what's in the best interest of the Chinese people, indeed of the world. The period of time before that is open to question. And here's where those who are sophisticated about it would have issues. And the claim would be in the West that because of the nature of the Chinese system, the top-down nature of it, and the concern of lower-level officials not to disrupt or not to do anything without approvals from higher levels, the lack of an independent media that could release information, that number of weeks or days or whatever was detrimental. And I think China has said that. President Xi has said lessons need to be learned, systems need to change. I think all that makes sense. I think that the danger is because we're locked in this battle over many other things, that the pandemic has sort of been brought into that, unfortunately, because I think the actual narrative of what really happened is not, there's really no blame. If a volcano erupts or an earthquake happens or a meteor hits, pandemic is largely the same. And human beings need to be allied in how they deal with it. But because of simplistic understandings, I think the divide is getting larger.
But the problem is the simplistic thinking, because in the eyes of the Chinese, yes, we also do some soul-searching and reflections. Why the Americans haven't understood that? They should also rethink about their systems, where the fault line is, where the vulnerabilities are.
No question, and I think people are doing that. It's just the nature of the system when you have such a severe disruption of the system, only paralleled by an all-out war when you're dealing with this kind of pandemic, that the system doesn't because of its diversity and its independent checks and balances and independent sources of power in terms of the executive branch, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and certainly the media. Those are all competing forces, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And when you need to have urgent mobilization, whether it's a pandemic or a war, that system doesn't work as well. But I think, you know, to represent the views of many of my countrymen, that is not the only criterion by which a system should be judged.
Professor Zhang, let's talk about Chinese Communist Party's plan, because the party has always been consistent in making plans and delivering on those plans. 2021 marks the date for China's first of the two centenary goals and also the 100th anniversary of the party. Do you think it will deliver, as it always did, on the targets of moderately prosperous society, per capita income double that of 2010, and also the total elimination of abject poverty?
Yeah, I think China is, on the whole, well on its way to achieve these objectives. And if you look at the overall GDP growth, so eventually by this year, China will be around $10,000 per capita GDP, which means we met this overall target. But what's more important is the fact that China has already created the world's largest middle class, real middle class, people with properties, with decent income. Even when they are in the United States, they are middle class, over 400 million people. And then in terms of fighting poverty, indeed, it's impressive, because if you look at the official figures, roughly we have about 6 million left in the category of abject poverty. So we are doing everything possible to meet this target. And this target is by no means low, because in addition to this whatever personal income level, there is a figure. What's more important is this objective of what's called the two no worries. No worry about food, no worry about clothing, plus 3 guarantees. Guarantees for education, health insurance, and housing. So you put this together, and then this will be real wipeout of the abject poverty in China. I visited quite a number of these so-called poverty regions in China. I must say the standards are reasonably high. If you put these so-called poor families into most developing countries, I visited over 70 of them, maybe these poor families at this level, after lifting from poverty, really belong to middle class in most countries in developing world. They have refrigerators, color television, smartphones, 4G service, housing, and land. So it's by no means easy, but we have done that. It's the greatest achievement, perhaps, in China's history. You wipe out the entire category of abject poverty, about close to 800 million. What's this? 75% also the world's poverty eradicated. Yeah.
And that will be a great contribution, not only to China, but also to the whole world, you think?
Yeah, that's true. And if you go to developing world, after all, most countries in the world are developing countries, the #1 challenge is absolutely fighting poverty and fighting disease. And China has done well in this regard.
Yeah.
This is also why, so many countries now looking to China, especially among the developing countries in Africa, etc. That also caused some, eyebrow, whatever concerns in the United States, as if there's a geopolitical competition. No, it's not China is pushing forward its model. Rather, it's when you are doing well, others come look to you for help and for guidance, for inspiration. Yeah. That's the case.
Dr. Kuhn, probably that's one of the reasons for the strategic anxieties the Americans feel about China. Because usually we've been comfortable seeing tensions in trade, economy, technology. But now we have seen more and more jarring words of U.S. politicians against Chinese political system and its legitimacy. For example, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and also Chief of Staff of the White House O'Brien has been saying the Chinese system is corrupt, it is repressive. Why that now?
The extreme commentary one is hearing in the political system is largely a product of the political season that the United States has entered into in terms of the presidential campaign, and all of the individuals on each side making their comments because they all will have jobs or responsibilities that they would like to have in one or the other administration. To analyze the situation properly, though, one needs to go below that and not look at those superficial answers. I had the great privilege over the last 5 years of really embedding myself in China's anti-poverty campaign. We've produced a major documentary called Voices from the Front Line, China's War on Poverty.
Impressive coverage there.
Which just has been nominated for a Los Angeles area Emmy. We'll find out if we win or not, but the nomination is good enough. There were thousands of entries. So the appreciation for what China has achieved in poverty alleviation among people is very real. I mean, I've experienced it myself. In fact, I've drawn an analogy, in which I think is a very strong one, between China's successful, what China called targeted poverty alleviation, and China's containment of the coronavirus, because both are founded on the same system of commitment. And I talk about three areas of commitment. One is the commitment of the party, which leads the country, and the second is the mobilization of resources and how it implements that. And that's done at 5 levels of local government: provincial, municipal, county, township, and village, under central government guidelines, of course. And then the third is, frankly, President Xi Jinping's personal commitment, which in the Chinese political system is exceedingly strong and filters down to all the officials. So with that in mind, you can really see between China's war on poverty and China's war on the coronavirus, 2 extraordinarily positive exemplars of the Chinese system. As I said before, that is not the only criterion to judge, but it is an important one. And I think a lot of people appreciate that. I've had many people tell us that these are things they didn't appreciate, didn't know about China. China's anti-poverty campaign is exceedingly important, and to appreciate, you need to actually divide it into 2 parts, because for the first roughly, I don't know, 700 more million people, it really wasn't poverty alleviation. It was economic development from 1978 and the economic reform and development. A rising tide lifts all boats, as they said. But roughly a little before President Xi took office in end of 2012, and he certainly emphasized it enormously, that no matter how big China's GDP would be per capita, income per capita, there would still be roughly 100 million people as of 2012 who would never get out of poverty because they lived in remote mountain villages or were infirm. And so this targeted plan, which was very deliberately implemented, where every poor family has their own dossier, and there's some local cadre, generally a young man, who was seconded to a village for 2 years to worry about every person. It's a remarkable system that works, and the more people appreciate it, the more they will see the objective of the party-led system, which is to improve the lives of the people.
Thank you very much, Professor Zhang, and thank you, Dr. Kuhn. You've been watching Dialogue here on CGTN. I'm in Beijing.